So can I start? Or yeah, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you are enjoy the meeting. And as a convener of our second day afternoon session, I'm happy to announce three amazing lectures, three amazing talks. You will see, you will hear today. And first lecture you will hear now is a lecture of Dr. Matthias van Merke. I hope I pronounced it right. Sorry if I made some mistakes. Matthias is associate professor at the University of Liège, and his research focuses of understanding geomorphic processes at regional, continental, and global scales, and understanding the sensitivity of these processes to climate change and land cover changes. So, Matthias, as you already know, we have 1 hour in total, including 45 minutes for lecture and 15 more minutes for answering questions. And yeah, I think you can start. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you all for joining. It's much appreciated. I'll try sharing my screen again. Just a second. Okay, so thank you and welcome all. In these next 45 minutes, I hope to explain you a bit more about gully erosion, and then mainly why it's important, how it influences sediment fluxes, and what we can and cannot do at this moment, mainly when it comes to predicting this process at larger scales. This presentation has mainly been building on work we've been doing over the past years, as well as some other research. But I like to emphasize that this is certainly not just my work, but also I had a lot of help from other researchers and PhD students. So maybe first of all, let's think about what actually is gully erosion, because it's maybe something that's not familiar to all of you. But basically these gullies I'll be talking about are large incisional channels that typically form on hill slopes, but also sometimes in alluvial plains. And they are generally caused by concentrated runoff or water discharge that starts to incise into the soil once specific thresholds are reached, and they can achieve very large dimensions. And because of their form, shape, and positions, they can have a lot of relevant impacts that are worthwhile studying, predicting, and avoiding where we can. One of these impacts is, for example, reduced crop yields. This is, for example, a photo from northern Ethiopia, where you see a gully flowing through a valley. And of course, you can see two things. Farmers lose arable land because of these gullies, but here you also see that closer to the gully borders, the crops are more wilting. They have less water available, so they are more yellow. And this will, of course, have a significant impact on crop yields because basically the gully drains the soil and leads to a lower water availability. In several cases, gullies can also cause infrastructural damage to roads, often claim casualties, etc. And this can become quite extreme. This is, for example, a picture I took in Kinshasa last year, where just an urban gully has formed very recently, the night before. And basically, it is a gully that incised through the road and destroyed several houses. And this is certainly not a unique case. This is, for example, an aerial photo of Kikwit in 2013. This is the same spot 6 years later in 2019. So here you had a gully that further advanced with about 400 meters and really destroyed several dozens of houses. leading to a lot of other impacts as well. Of course, while this is an important geohazard in many cases, it's also an important geomorphic process with significant effects on, for example, catchment sediment loads. First of all, because gullies are an important cause of soil loss. This is, for example, a study from Jean Pouzin in Spain many years ago, where they measured basically the volume of eroded rills and gullies along a transect going from the top of a hill downwards in the valley. What you see is that rill erosion is often quite significant in a volume expressed per hectare and per year, but that the gullies can far exceed this and are often a much more dominant sediment source. Basically, what we see on this graph is the same as on the schedule or on the schema I showed you earlier. A gully may as as small rills, but at a given point, there's a threshold where the runoff volume becomes so large that it really easily incises into the soil and can become much larger, leading to very large soil losses. Furthermore, because gullies are often basically channels, they can have a large influence on the catchment hydrology. For example, leading to higher flood frequencies and magnitudes, but also reduced base flows. For the base flows, I already showed you an example for Ethiopia, where the soil is basically drained because of a gully. This is another study from colleagues in Brazil, where they monitored basically two similar catchments close to each other, one with a gully and one without a gully. If you then just look for the same rainfall events and period to the river discharges, you see that in the preserved catchment without gullies, there are some floods, but in the eroded catchment with gullies, the flood response is, of course, much faster, much more erratic, while the base flow is much lower. Linked to that, gullies can also influence the sediment connectivity. They are in fact additional drainage lines, and as a result, they decrease the distance that needs to be covered from, let's say, a hill slope that may erode until the river channel. So these are, for example, two photos from the same spot in Ethiopia again. In the very far background, you can barely see it. There's a large river channel, the Agula River. Normally, what happens on this hill slope here in front would have no impact on the river below or on the sediment load. But of course, since you have this dendritic river network, you see that during a runoff event, a lot of this water enters into the gully channel and will, because of that, also end up in the stream, affecting sediment loads. We have, for the moment, quite little tools that can actually quantify or correctly incorporate such connectivity effects. But this is, for example, already an attempt by some of my colleagues, where they basically developed an erosion index incorporating for all processes, all the erosion processes themselves, including gully erosion, and plotted these indexes against the observed sediment yields of several catchments in Spain. Basically, you see two populations, one very low and one very high. And basically, those catchments with a much stronger relation are also those with a higher sediment delivery ratio. And what makes this sediment delivery ratio higher? It's mainly the fact that there are gullies. So not that these gullies only cause additional sediments or cause additional erosion and increase the sediment supply. Their main effect may often be just to increase the connectivity. So these impacts of gully erosion on sediment yields may be very high. And this is also something we observe at continental scales. This is, for example, a compilation of different sediment yield measurement data for different catchment sizes. And what you already see is that sediment yields are, on average, or for even in median, easily 5 times higher than hill slope erosion rates that do not account for gully erosion, so just sheet and rill erosion. If you then look to the spatial patterns of, for example, sediment yields in Europe, you see that there are several important hotspots where sediment yields are very high, but where if you compare it with a map of sheet and rill erosion on the left, there's not necessarily a lot of sheet and rill erosion going there on there. So the main cause for these high values are most likely gully erosion. The same is true, for example, in Africa. Also here we compiled all the data we could find on observed sediment yields, and we can identify several hotspots. Each of these hotspots is mainly characterized by a lot of gully erosion. So despite decades, in fact, of research, our ability to really model gully erosion remains, in fact, limited, but not just limited, very, very limited. This is especially so at such large scales for large regions or continents. And what makes this hard is, in fact, that you'll need to obtain a trade-off between, let's say, an accurate process description, as well as keeping the data requirements for a detailed model as low as possible. So you can make a highly complex model, but not apply it at such a large scale, or you can aim for a very simple model that can be applied at a continental scale, but does not fully capture what is going on with these gullies. And this is a point I hope to illustrate throughout this talk. But because we can model gully erosion very badly, we also know quite little about its actual contribution to catchment sediment export rates and to further assess the impacts that gully erosion may have in that regard. And such tools to assess impacts and avoid negative consequences are badly needed. This is already clear when we look, for example, to other erosion studies. This is a study by Borelli showing the change in sheet and rill erosion rates, so overland erosion rates over the past decades because of land use changes. What you see is that especially in the global south, so in South America and sub-Saharan Africa mainly, erosion rates have already drastically increased. And this will likely continue so in the future. This is, for example, the population projections per continent for this century. As you can see, Africa is expected to see an increase of over 3 billion people over the coming decades. So this really emphasizes the need for good tools that can assess the impacts, for example, of land use changes on erosion rates. So what we are working on with our team is basically to develop tools and models that allow us to predict gully erosion at regional and continental scales, but also assess the role of gully erosion for catchment sediment yields and other impacts at such scales. We mainly apply rather empirical approaches that build, however, on existing modeling concepts we obtained over the past decades, and a lot of our research focuses on Africa. So while building this model, we have in fact several working hypotheses that are that may or may not be correct, but that help us basically constrain and frame the problem so that it becomes feasible. So a first limitation of our work and most of this talk is that we mainly focus on permanent gullies. There are also ephemeral gullies, smaller gullies that are tilled away by farmers, but as they are very difficult to map at such scales, I do not want to claim that our results are really representative for this erosion form. Also, our model mainly focuses on modeling long-term average gully erosion rates. So not on an event basis, but rather like the revised universal soil loss equation for sheet and rill erosion. We hope to start saying something about what is on average the rate of gully erosion. And the basic structure or idea behind our model we try to develop is that gully erosion can in fact be subdivided in two key factors that can be modeled separately. First of all, there's the gully density, and second, there's the gully expansion rate per gully. And for this gully expansion rate, we mainly assume for the moment that gully headcut retreat is the most important process. Several studies tend to confirm this, but this is also our starting point. So what is our main modeling strategy? Basically to first develop a model for gully expansion or gully headcut retreats, and then also focus on gully density, develop a second model for that, and then we can couple both to obtain the gully erosion rate. So what I want to do in the rest of this talk is share my insights in this on what we know now about the controlling factors of gully headcut retreat rates at global scales. So the expansion rates, then also present some recent advancements in predicting gully densities and initiation, to then move on to some ongoing work and scope for further research, mainly how can we combine these two for saying something about the total gully erosion rate. So let's start with saying something more about these gully headcut retreat rates. Basically, a gully head, as you see in the landscape here, is the end or the starting point of a gully. And this starting point advances upslope or upstream through time typically. And a lot of studies have quantified this process, and it is often quite significant. This is, for example, an image from Ionita in Romania. As you can see, in 1980, the gully was at the very left part of the picture. In 2005, it advanced with several hundreds of meters. A lot of studies have tried to compile and measure this process and obtained interesting local insights in what drives this process. However, the results strongly differed as they varied strongly from one region to another. Soil type, land use, all these things can play a role. So what we did in this review is basically compile all these measurements we could find worldwide and do basically a meta-analysis of these measurements to see what explains this global this process at a global scale. What are the most important controlling factors? For those interested, this is a study that was published in 2016, Earth Science Reviews, and we also included the whole data set of measurements for those wanting to have a look. So what were our key results? Basically, these gully headcut retreat rates, here they are expressed as a volumetric retreat rates in cubic meters per year. They are strongly correlated by the contributing area, and more or less the square root of this contributing area. This is quite logical and known, meaning because if you have a larger area draining towards that gully headcut, you can have more water accumulated to that head, and that water can cause more erosion. In fact, the main surprise of this result was that the relation was significant, but only so weak. It only explains around 15% of the variation, which was a bit surprising because we expected this to be higher. So we looked on and saw and explored what else can explain this global variation. And in fact, the key factor we identified was rainfall intensity. We tested several proxies for this, and what worked best was basically what is called the rainy day normal, which is a very simple proxy. It just gives you it just takes the average annual rainfall for that site divided by the average number of days on which it rains. So it expresses the amount of rainfall on a day with rain. Now what we see is that this long-term average RDN values explain about half of the observed variation in gully headcut retreat rates. And this is quite remarkable because, as you notice, the y-axis on this graph is logarithmic. So headcut retreat rates may vary from just a few kilograms per year up to over hundreds of thousands of tons per year. So really full truckloads of dirt that are removed every year because of gully erosion. And 50% of that variation is explained by rainfall intensity. If you combine it then with our other factor, contributing area, saying something about how much water can be accumulated, you explain already nearly 70% of the observed variation in headcut retreat rates. There's a second lesson to be drawn for this, and that is the sensitivity to potential climate change. As you see in this relation, the RDN, the rainfall intensity, is in the formula with an exponent of nearly 5. So this means that a slight change in rainfall intensity can have enormous consequences on headcut retreat rates. And such changes are exactly also what are predicted. So basically, this is a study showing expected changes in daily rainfall intensity or rainy day normal. This is expected to increase worldwide with about 10 to 15%. This implies 10 to 15% to the power 5 would imply that if all other factors remain the same, gully erosion rates may easily double or triple over the next century. Strangely enough, these were the only factors that we could clearly identify at such global scales. To some extent, this might be because of the fact that often we do not have all the details of the measurements. It's a meta-analysis, so the data quality may also vary a bit. But it's at least surprising to see, for example, that a factor like land use or land cover have only a very, very slight and even not statistically significant effects. The second reason might be for this that, in fact, the ranges in land use conditions are quite narrow. All these studies are, for example, conducted in erosion-prone landscape with active headcuts. That's why scientists went into the field and measured them. So that might be an important factor. But we expect that once a gully is triggered, the actual land use might also be less important, and the process is really driven by runoff, which is controlled by contributing area and the amount of rainfall. Nonetheless, land use, as we know from previous work, is likely very important in explaining why you have gullies or not. And then we move to the second part, saying something about gully densities. And if we want to say something about gully densities and model this process, we of course need to say something first about what we already know about the controlling factors of gully initiation. So if you can initiate more gullies, you will form more gullies, and the gully density will of course increase. And we know from previous work, of course, that gullies mainly form when the power of runoff water is large enough to start incising into the soil. That's the same with river erosion. But if this process continues, this will become deeper and deeper, and you will form a headcut that starts to retreat upslope. And what researchers have focused on so far is something that is called the slope area threshold. What does this slope area threshold imply? Basically, it's a more simple and empirical reflection of the fact that in order to incise into the soil, you need to pass a certain resistance. And this is expressed between a critical velocity or shear stress that needs to be exceeded and depends on soil characteristics. The actual shear stress or velocity caused by water that runs off is determined by several factors, but they mainly depend on the hydraulic radius or the discharge and the slope angle. And we know that slope area, or we know that, as I said before, a good proxy for the runoff discharge or the hydraulic radius is often this contributing area, the area upstream of a gully head, while also the slope is something we can easily measure from, for example, a digital elevation model. So what does the slope area threshold concept then implies? It shows basically where a gully might form or not based on just a digital elevation model. And these are some illustrations of this. So every cross here is the exact position of a gully head, and more specifically, what is the area draining towards that position in the landscape, and what is the local slope. And what you see is that in all these cases, there seems to be a lower line, meaning that if you are in a combination with a slope or a contributing area that is below this threshold, you will likely not form a gully. If you are above this threshold, it is possible to have a gully at that spot. And we know from earlier work that this is already a very handy tool to predict where in an area you might form gullies. This is at a very local scale in Belgium. You see the gray zones. These are basically the topographic positions in a landscape where the slope area threshold is exceeded for this type. The dark lines are the observed gullies. So you see here that in this case, the position of the gullies is generally well predicted. But one important limitation is, of course, that these thresholds, they are empirical thresholds and they vary from region to region, from study area to study area. And what will determine their empirical constants? It's basically a lot of things: the soil characteristics, local weather conditions, but also, and probably especially, land use. And this is, for example, a synthesis figure by Tori and Pouzin in a review paper, where they compiled these different slope area thresholds. And what they notice is that indeed, for forest and grasslands, these thresholds are a lot higher than, for example, for cropland, which is logical because cropland offers less soil protection, but it's also more likely to generate more runoff than a forest or grassland. So this implies that the slope area concept might be something interesting on the long term to also use to predict gully erosion at regional and continental scales, but many difficulties basically remain. Basically, we need to find ways to incorporate also the role of other controlling factors like climate and weather conditions, the spatial patterns of the land use and soil characteristics, potentially effects of temporal land use dynamics, etc. And it's especially there that we quickly encounter the limits of the input data we have at such scales. Not only that, also not all these controls are quite well understood at the moment. So once again, as I said in the beginning of the talk, there's a kind of trade-off between being sufficiently accurate in a physical way and describing the process in detail, and limiting the input errors because your input data is subject to uncertainties of limited resolution and you cannot account for all factors. For example, we might know that the organic material in the soil is an important factor in some cases to form a gully or not. But if you don't really have data on that, you cannot really use it to predict gully erosion at such large scale. So what we are interested in is finding this sweet spot or this minimum in the total model error. And this total error depends on the one hand, the model error, how accurately is your process described, and the input error, how well adapted is your input data to actually simulate this process. So where are we at the moment then with regard to modeling gully density? We have moved, I think, quite far over the past years. And the first question we need to ask is, how do we actually quantify a gully density? What is typically used is total gully length, for example, in kilometer per square kilometer, but also often an areal fraction covered by gullies. This says a bit more because it accounts also for the width of the gully, and it allows for faster data collection, which is important at large scales because you can approximate the area gully density just by selecting, for example, a number of random points and then checking which fraction falls inside a gully or not. And this fraction gives a good approximation of the areal gully density. So this is something we tried 5 or 6 years ago. In, for example, the Chinese Loess Plateau, where we quantified average gully density for a number of catchments, 46 in the Chinese Loess Plateau. And then using a simple empirical approach, a multiple regression model, we could already predict quite well the average gully density at such catchment scale. And this seemed to be mainly depending on topographic conditions as well as vegetation cover. So these results are quite robust, but using aerial gully density also comes with important limitations. For example, they are the results of both gully initiation and expansion. We know expansion, head cut, retreat, but do we have a high area of gullies because we have formed many gullies, or because the gullies we formed are very nice or are very large? So this is a distinction we need to make. Secondly, we know also that gullies are formed often under very local conditions because slope and contributing area in combination with land use exceeds a certain threshold, for example. An aerial density just says something about the spatial fraction on average. So it does not really allow at the catchment scale to zoom in on why do you have a gully on that location or why not. So for this, we started developing an alternative approach where we did not measure the lengths or the area of gullies at the catchment scale, but started to look to the actual gully head density. How many gully heads do you have per square kilometer? And to do this, we started generating random sites of only 1 square kilometer and mapped all the gully heads within that test site that we could find. So this was an example for Tunisia. This is, for example, a case in Madagascar, where you see some gullies here and all the pins indicate the exact position of a gully head. This is still an ongoing study from one of my PhD students, but we are moving quite far in collecting data at the continental scale for Africa. So far, we have around 1,600 sites. About 2/3 of those are spread randomly across the continent. About 1/3 is concentrated in really important hotspots. And in total, we mapped already around 44,000 heads this way. And just looking to the data already reveals some interesting patterns. For example, we see that on average, 1 site in 3 of the randomly distributed sites have at least 1 gully, while more than 5% can have more than 100 gullies. So this means that if you go any place in Africa, the chances that you find a gully somewhere within 1 square kilometer are quite significant, confirming that this is indeed a highly important process. Also, we detect already some important regional variations. As I said, important sediment yield hotspots are, for example, Northern Africa, Ethiopia, and Madagascar. As expected and confirmed by our data, these are also exactly the spots where we find a lot of gully heads. We explored this data set already a little bit just by looking to the sites with at least 1 gully head mapped and try to see what explains then these spatial differences in gully head density. We did some basic statistical analysis on this and discovered that mainly NDVI, soil characteristics like the percentage of soil and topography play an important role in explaining this variability. And with this, you can already construct a first simple regression model predicting the gully head density based on such simple factors. Such model can explain already around 57% of the observed variation, which is definitely not a bad start. Around 95% of our predictions are correct within 1 order of magnitude. If you then know that gully densities can vary over 3 or 4 order of magnitudes easily, that's not so bad at all. However, such approach, we learned, also comes with important limitations. For example, using a classical multiple regression does not really allow you to fully identify important feedbacks and interactions between relevant factors. For example, it might be that steeper slopes are more prone to gully erosion, but often they are also more stony, have less deep soils, and are more likely to be forested. So these are important interactions, and if you just look at it with one multiple regression equation at the continental scale, these are things you cannot digitally capture. Above all, we also noticed that while our data set is already quite large, we nearly did not have, or we clearly did not have enough data yet to really capture and analyze statistically all these local variations. And mapping individual gully heads on such a scale for thousands of sites is something very, very labor intensive. So that's why recently we started developing an alternative approach where we used, on the one hand, machine learning, as this is more flexible to account for potential feedbacks, but also where we used a more semi-quantitative approach to map gully head densities. That may be a bit less accurate than really mapping the exact position, but that is much, much faster. So how did we do this? Basically, we continued working with just random test sites of 1 square kilometer, and we divided each test site into a grid of 9 cells. And then we would visually expect for every of these cells, how many gully heads do we observe in that cell. So just to explain here, the example I show, there's an inset A, and you may see red dots. These are actual gully heads that you can easily detect in Google Earth. Instead of mapping all this, we would just assign a score to this. 0 means that there's no gullies in that grid cell. 1 means there's between 1 to 5. 3 means more than 21. And in this case, 2 means somewhere between 6 and 20 gullies. So this is less accurate than really counting the gullies. But we notice that overall, the uncertainty associated with such scores remains quite limited, while the approach is easily 10 times faster, which means that you can obtain a reasonable assessment saying here there are, let's say, about 40 to 50 gullies in, let's say, 1 or 2 minutes, while before mapping this would easily take 20 or 30 minutes. So this speed advantage allowed you to collect more data for a much larger area in a much faster or in the same amount of time. And that's what we tried in this study for the Horn of Africa. Basically, we mapped gully densities this way for around 2,700 sites across this area. Most of these points were random, but then we also targeted, again, some zones where we know gully densities were quite high, but uncertainties on our first model were quite large as well. With this data set of 1,700 files, we then applied our 1,700 sites, sorry. We then applied a machine learning approach using random forest, combined also with an uncertainty assessment. I'm going to spare you the details, but the idea was that for each of these sites, we extract a large number of factors that may help explaining why there are gullies or not. So for example, slope steepness, the land use, soil characteristics, the rainfall, etc. And then the random forest approach would basically build decision trees to see, okay, if the slope is high and the soil is like this, then I can classify this site as having so many gullies. That is repeated many, many times. And the resulting random forest gives then an average prediction of, based on all these decision trees he builds, what is most likely to be the observed value. So this is a purely empirical approach. Basically also a large black box, but what we noticed is that it works quite well. This is, for example, all the observations we have, so the estimated gully head densities per square kilometer. This is the resulting map if you apply then this random forest to the whole study area. As you can already see visually, our model succeeds quite well in reproducing these spatial tendencies. What is more interesting, or even more interesting, is that this also seems to offer a lot of room for further improvements. And basically, one thing we noticed is that the more data you can put into this model, the better your prediction becomes. So this is shown on the left. So we use different subsets of data. Each time we validated it with an independent validation set, so the red points. But then first we tried training it only with the blue points, and then your model efficiency is basically around 0. If you just add 500 additional points or 400 additional points, your model jumps already a lot higher in terms of performance. If you then include also additional targeted points, it goes even better. And if you include both data sets, so both the random and the targeted additional points, your model improves further. So we have certainly not reached the limit of this yet. Our main point here was to illustrate that this is really a fruitful approach, but it does not fully solve a problem. For example, as I said, it is mainly a black box model, and you can get something what is called feature importances from such a random forest approach, which tells you on average how important, how often does a variable occur in decision trees, and what role does it play in making decisions. This can generate schemes like this, but it does not say you why certain factors are important. And a lot of these importances are quite surprising and maybe even counterintuitive. I will not discuss this here in detail due to a lack of time, but basically, it also does not tell you if a certain effect, like the fraction of silt in your soil, if that's a positive or negative effect. So one of the implications is that our previous work on mapping these individual gully heads is certainly not obsolete. And a random forest approach or machine learning can help us in understanding where gully erosion is going on and why. But if we really want to develop tools that can predict how will this evolve in the future and what land use management strategies are we going to need to use to avoid impacts, we will need something less black box and something more process oriented. And this is something we're also still working on. So basically the fact that we know the position of all these individual gully heads allows us also to apply, for example, a real slope area threshold concept, and then not just use the contributing area, but really estimate the volumes of runoff based, for example, on a simple runoff model. This is something we're working on, but our first results are really encouraging. So to wrap up, what can we say then about the total gully erosion rate? So as I said, this gully erosion rate can then basically seen as the product of how fast gullies expand, headcut retreat, and how many gullies there are, gully densities. We are not there yet in developing a full model that can predict this, but we can already obtain some insights using some very simple assumptions and approximation. For example, for each site we mapped, we know from previous work that the average contributing area to a gully head is around 4 hectares. And we know that if we know this contributing area, and we know the rainy day normal, which we can extract quite easily, we can estimate the gully headcut retreat rates. So if we just multiply the number of observed gully heads with the headcut retreat rate, we can get a crude order of magnitude estimate of the actual gully erosion rate at that site. And it's important to really emphasize that these numbers are likely strong overestimations, above all because not all headcuts remain active and some stabilize over time. This is something we do not account for here. But what is most strange or surprising in such simple multiplication exercise is that the observed number of gully heads says very little about the resulting hypothetical gully erosion rate that you would expect at this site. And why is that? or it might be even lower than what is indicated in this very low scatter plot, because here we do not account for the fact that if you have more gully heads at a site, their average contributing area will also decline. So this regression line would likely become even flatter. So why is this that we do not find any relation between, or not a strong relation between the number of head cuts and the number of and the total gully erosion rates at such scale? It's mainly because the head cut retreat rate, which is then mainly controlled by rainfall intensity only, is likely much more important than only or than the number of heads. This is of course only a statistical consideration. We only notice that gully head densities vary between 1 and 3, for example, while erosion rates may 1 and 1,000, sorry, head cuts per square kilometer, while erosion rates may easily vary between less than a ton and several hundreds of thousands of tons, so 7 orders of magnitudes. So what can we say then about catchment sediment yields? Knowing all this, not so much yet, but I think the results here are also very encouraging. And this is a simple experiment we did for 7 catchments in Ethiopia again, where we mapped the gully head density as well as the aerial density. And both proxies are closely related. However, if you then plot them against the observed sediment yield, you indeed see that these gully head densities have an even, that both correlate well with sediment yield, but that especially these gully head densities tend to explain a large fraction of the observed variation. These may seem to contradict what I just said, that it's not their gully, the number of gully heads, but their retreat rates. But in fact, this is not the case, because we are all looking to catchments here that are very similar in rainfall intensity properties. So they likely have quite similar head cut retreat rates. And in that case, of course, it's mainly the number of gullies that you have in a catchment that will determine the erosion rate. And as this strong correlation suggests, this will have a very strong influence on catchment sediment yields, likely because these gullies are indeed a very significant sediment source. So just to wrap up, gully erosion modeling at continental scale is clearly becoming more and more feasible. If you look to the gully head cut retreat rate problems, this seems to be something that is mainly driven by climate and then especially rainfall intensity. We can quantify this, and this already helps us a lot, but it also shows that gullies are highly sensitive to climate change probably. When it comes to gully densities, this is also becoming quite predictable at such large scales with acceptable accuracies. And then here, especially land use and vegetation cover, as well as topography and soil characteristics seem to play an important role. The gully expansion rates likely have a far greater influence, however, on the total gully erosion rates than the observed gully densities at a given moment. But if we manage to couple both types of models, it should become feasible to also predict gully erosion rates on average on the longer timescales. And this opens interesting perspectives to also predict catchment sediment yields. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Matthias, for such an impressive talk. I learned a lot of new as a work quality professional, not related very close to geomorphic processes and erosion. So thank you very much. And we have a number of questions. And first question is from Kate Crusting, student, undergrad student of Moscow State Hydrology Department. And she'd like to know, what is the role of human impact on the gully erosion?
Well, the role can be quite large, but then it's mainly via land use changes. So if we, for example, start deforesting certain slopes, and start to cultivate that land, what happens mostly is that your runoff will proceed or will increase, and you will be more likely to exceed what we call this critical threshold in shear stress, and a gully may form. So that is the most classical example. And this is something that is still going on quite fast, for example, in the global south. But there are, as I showed you some pictures, much more extreme situations, like, for example, in tropical cities. This is also a form of land use change that can generate a lot of runoff and can also cause large gullies. A second indirect role is, of course, via climate change, which is also something that strongly influences gully erosion.
Sure. Thank you very much. The next question is from Murad from Algeria. And the question is, what is the role of rainfall erosivity, erosion, in terms of sediment yield?
So, as I just showed in the presentation, we see that gully heads retreat rates are often strongly influenced by rainfall intensity. And we know the same for example, sheet and rill erosion on the surface. However, if you just look to catchment sediment yields, we know that it should play a role, but you have had a lot of studies before in the past that show that this is very complex. And if you would plot, for example, rainfall versus sediment yield, often you find no clear relation. And why is that? Because you have a lot of other controlling factors, including topography, the soil type, but also important feedbacks, and then mainly with vegetation cover. If you have more rain, it can also mean that you have better vegetation cover and less proneness to erosion. So there's quite a bit of literature, and it really depends on the situation. But the most famous example, I think, is the studies of Langba and Schum, I think in the 50s. So you can surely look into that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. The next question is from undergrad students, Moscow State University Hydrology Department, Artem Gorbarenko. And the question is, what is the reason for choosing random forest analysis? What's the advantages of this model over the other machine learning approaches?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
We chose random forests because they are still conceptually understandable and they are not too calculation intensive, which remains an important issue at such large scales. But you also have supported vector machine and a lot of other approaches, and quite a bit of studies have already tested them as well at case study levels. There's quite a bit of studies in Iran that compared different approaches of machine learning to predict gully erosion. We looked into that literature, and what we found from that, or concluded from that, is that random forests are basically among the better techniques to do that. At least based on these case studies. And given that it is also something feasible and understandable, that's why we tested it in this study.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, agree with you about that. And the next question is from Neja, sorry if I pronounce it wrong, Mjad, doctor on geochemistry and environment. And the question is the impact of gully development on hydrology sediment yield and landscape evolution can change according to climate and land use conditions?
Yes, definitely.
Absolutely.
So indeed, if land use changes, this can have a huge impact on the formation of gullies, and again, the hydrological impacts, the impacts on sediment loads, etc. But this works both ways. There are many areas that are very arid, where you have already a lot of gullies, and they can continue to influence the hydrology and the connectivity. But because these areas became arid, it's often likely that the gullies are much older and were formed under wetter conditions. But then the area became more arid, less rainfall, and the gullies just remain in the landscape. Although they do not further expand, they are somehow fossilized in the landscape. And that is, of course, an important distinction. It's not because you have a lot of gullies that you have a lot of gully erosion, but the gullies that are there can continue to have an impact.
Okay, thank you very much. And the last question from myself, or from me, why did you choose African continent for such a large continental analysis of gully erosion, but not an Asian continent, for example? I mean, Asian continent is the most populated continent.
Yeah, good question. Because we believe that the research needs are, in fact, mainly lying in Africa, and a lot of, or so far, not a lot of studies have focused on this continent, while a lot more work has concentrated, for example, on the Chinese Loess Plateau. And I'm looking again for the graph. But if you just look to the projections, I'll share my screen again quickly. If you just look to the projections, at the moment, there are around 1.2 billion Africans.
Right.
In 2100, it's projected that this will be 4.2. And of course, this will have huge impacts on the land use and as a result on the erosion rates. And that's what this map already shows for sheet and rill erosion. Erosion rates are mainly increasing over the past decades in these areas. But we cannot fully predict this yet. So this basically explains why we want to concentrate on this continent. This in combination with the fact that it's also a continent that has a very large climatic variability and variability in other environmental settings, making it very interesting to study erosion processes at a large scale.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. It's great. Thank you again, Matthias, for such great talk. And it was a pleasure to have you here as one of our lecturers.
The pleasure was mine.
And we continue our session with the second lecture presented by Caroline Clayson. Caroline, do you hear me? Could you, okay.
Hi, Oksana, I can hear you fine.
Hello, yeah, that's great. So I'm very proud to introduce Caroline. She's an associate professor of glaciology at the University of Plymouth, and Caroline's research is focused on the relationship between glaciers and hydrology. And she's particularly interested in the role of glaciers on water quantity and quality. Such an amazing talk is coming. So our schedule is you have 45 minutes for about 45 minutes for lecture and another 15 minutes for answering questions. And I will translate your questions from YouTube stream we have now. And would you like to add something, Sergey? I don't
Just
know.
say hello to Caroline. Thanks you accepting. To see you.
Sure.
3 years past since we met in Tarfala.
Yeah.
So I think, Caroline, you can start now. And if our technician committee technicians could share this possibility to share your screen.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So please start.
Is that okay? Can you see that okay, Oksana?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Perfect. So thanks very much for that nice introduction. So as Oksana said, I'm going to be talking about the downstream impacts of retreating glaciers on water security, both from a water quantity angle, but largely today from a water quality angle. Thanks very much to Sergey and the organising committee for the invitation to talk today. It's really nice to be able to contribute. So a bit about who I am. First, I started life studying geography and environmental science in Scotland, and then went on to do a PhD in glaciology, and that's very much the field that I've continued to work in. I've spent time in Vancouver in Canada. I was a postdoc in Stockholm University in Sweden for 4 years, and more recently I've been based back in the UK as an associate professor at the University of Plymouth. So there's 3 parts to the talk I'm going to give today. The first part provides an introduction to glaciers as freshwater resources. The second will focus, this is probably the sort of large part of the talk, will focus on contaminants in the cryosphere and the impact they have on water quality. And in part 3, I'll just briefly introduce another project that I started working on in the last couple of years that's much more focused around the water, food, energy security nexus and the impact that glaciers have on that. So we'll start off with talking about glaciers as a freshwater resource first. And apologies if you know a lot of this already, but I know that we might have a fairly broad audience here today. So a bit about water security then. What is it? Essentially, water security is access to drinking water and sanitation, and it is a key component of that nexus, those 3 things that we need to know about, which are central to sustainable development and also to livelihoods as well. And as we know, there are pressures from lots of different areas, pressures on food due to growing population, land use practices that can impact on that food production and thus things like water resources too, and economic growth. And all of that produces a huge amount of pressure on that nexus. But I would argue that water is probably the most exploited of the natural resources, and about 70% of the extraction of water can be attributed directly to agriculture, to food production. So it's very much a circle of dependency on these different natural resources. In addition to food production and water security challenges, there's also land degradation caused by different land use practices. I saw in the talk before, we're talking about gully erosion, and obviously there are impacts of land use practices on that, and downstream impacts in terms of water and sediment transport too. And if we think about energy consumption as well, about 30% of global energy consumption is also attributable to food production and supply. So water security is inextricably linked with all of these other components of the security nexus. So coming on to glaciers then, what do they contribute? Glaciers, ice caps and ice sheets, so the main land ice bodies in the world, cover about 10% of the Earth's surface. But despite that being quite a small percentage, they actually contain about 70% of the total fresh water globally. So a huge amount, and much more than we see in our lakes and rivers. So they are very much a store of fresh water that are really integral to people downstream. And that's particularly important in areas such as the Himalayas and the Andes, where literally hundreds of millions of people are directly reliant on fresh water from glaciers upstream. For sometimes just part of the year if there's a dry season, but sometimes for much longer periods of the year as well. And in these regions, in places like the South American Andes, glacier contribution, not just to drinking water, but also to irrigation and energy in particular, is becoming increasingly important as we move forward. But as I'm going to talk about in this talk as well, in addition to water quantity and how much is available to support the nexus, the quality of that water is also crucial. And I would include things like the sediment load, as well as anthropogenic and natural contaminants in that talk about quality as well. So this slide just tries to show quite how reliant some parts of the world are on glacial meltwater. On the right side of the screen, the concentric circles which show Bolivia, Peru, Chile and Argentina. The largest circles on the outside, the lighter colour, this corresponds to hectares of land where glacier melt contributes between 45 and 100%. And in the smaller circle, the darker blue, hectares of land where glacier melt contributes between 80 and 100%. So in Bolivia, we're talking about 61,000 hectares where glacier melt is contributing up to 100% of that irrigation, and 402,000 hectares where it contributes between 45 and 100. So really, really large quantities. And if we think about how that translates to domestic water use, each of these little eye symbols to the right, each of these correspond to 1,000 people. And in black, those shows how many people are reliant on glacier melt for between 45 and 80% of their domestic water use. And in the red, that shows how many people are reliant on glacier melt for between 80 and 100%. So in Bolivia, there are over 500,000 people directly relying on glacier melt for at least half of their water use, where in Peru, more than half of the 360,000 people relying on glacier melt are very, very reliant on it for at least 80% of their water supply. And this is really important, as you can see on the figure on the right, left-hand side, because of variations in annual average rainfall, and a lot of the part of the coastal parts of South America are particularly dry and heavily reliant on this glacier melt. Another important consideration is something called peak water. This is a bit like the peak oil concept, but we apply it to water. And essentially, this tells us that glaciers melt in response to climate and create more and more meltwater as they do, so as they melt more in response to warming. But at some point in time, they reach this critical point that's called peak water, where the glacier has shrunk enough in response to climate that it can no longer produce enough melt to keep up that previous level of discharge. And this is really important because once regions reach this point, they really start to have to be concerned about their water resources and how they can manage them appropriately under a climate of reducing water resources downstream. Now, for some regions, estimates are that this period of peak water is already passed, and South America is one of the regions for which some of the glacial regions are already past that point. In Europe, in the Alps, we think that peak water is around about now in terms of the maximum amount of meltwater produced by the glaciers. So it's a bit of a boom and bust situation. We have lots of water now, but we can expect a lot less in the future. And in the Himalayas, partly due to the climate, but also due to the nature of the glaciers there, a lot of them are debris covered, for example, we predict that peak water is still to come. So perhaps we can learn lessons from other parts of the world and how they have dealt with the peak water issue to apply this to areas like the Himalayas down the line. So that's just an introduction to glacier contribution to downstream water resources. And before I come back to thinking more about the quantity issue, I want to focus really for the main part of the talk on this issue of contaminants in the cryosphere and impacts for water quality. So glaciers are obviously large bodies of ice and snow, and they store decades and hundreds and thousands of years worth of history in terms of atmospheric elements, in terms of pollen and all sorts of other things that are trapped in the layers of snow and ice in the glaciers. But they're also stores for anything else that fall onto their surface. So that could be elements from atmospheric deposition, that could come from accidents, so maybe helicopter or plane crashes in remote regions, incidents with snowmobiles or fuel drops in Antarctica, for example. So very much anthropogenic activity. And also anything that results from mass movements, so both landslide and avalanche activity. So it's not just the snow and ice that are stored in the glaciers, it's anything else that's available on their surface too. And we sort of see that today in some more rarely studied contaminants in the cryosphere. And what I'm focusing on in this talk are fallout radionuclides, so the product of weapons testing and nuclear incidents like Chernobyl. These are often used as tracers in the environment for other contaminants as well, but I'm actually focusing on them as contaminants themselves for the purposes of this talk. So because glaciers are retreating in response to climate change, there's a risk that those historical contaminants, so things like Chernobyl, now from 35 years ago, and weapons testing era going back to the 50s and 60s, still stored in the ice, But through that increased melt in response to a warming climate, there's a risk of secondary release of contaminants into the downstream, what we call the proglacial environment, through both direct melting of the glacier and down wasting. So essentially the glacier becoming thinner as it melts and wastes away. So the aim that myself and my colleagues had when looking into this topic was trying to improve understanding of how fallout radionuclides are stored and released from glacier catchments across the global cryosphere. And also whether they're present at potentially harmful levels or not. Are they just diluted enough that they're no problem downstream? And this latter part is still something that we're very much looking to understand more. So to start off with, when I first got interested in this topic, I wanted to conduct a sort of proof of concept study first. And I chose to do this in Arctic Sweden in the Tarfala Valley, where I met Sergei a few years ago, actually. And I chose this site because I know it well, and also because the Isfalls Glaciären catchment is very much a closed catchment. There are moraines that are marked in pink and green on the map on the top right there that bound the catchment. And so any meltwater coming from the glacier has to go through these two lakes that you can see on the map. So we know that meltwater is being trapped within that catchment. That allows us to study the transport of sediments and contaminants really nicely in that region. So it's quite a small glacier, and it retreated quite rapidly between about 1916 and 1990. And since then, although the terminus, so the sort of downstream point of the glacier, has stayed roughly the same, it's thinned at a really quite rapid rate, leading to quite a steep ice surface and also a heavily crevassed ice surface, which makes it a little bit tricky to work on in terms of doing field research. So we focused on the southern lobe of the glacier terminus, which is the least steep part, to allow us to go and collect samples on the ice surface as well as in front of the glacier. So during our field campaign back in 2017, we collected cryoconite. I'll tell you more about what that is. I suspect a lot of you wouldn't have heard of this before, but essentially it's a sediment from the ice surface. Collected samples from the moraines and the proglacial river outwash, and also retrieved a lake core for looking at chronology in the catchment as well. And all of these samples were taken back to the University of Plymouth, and we analysed them using gamma spectrometry, wavelength dispersive XRF, particle size analysis, and bulk stable isotope analysis as well, so we could look at organic content. So what's gamma spectrometry? This is not my area of specialism, but luckily I have lots of fantastic colleagues who do work closely in this, and I'm starting to learn more about it. But essentially gamma spectrometry quantifies radionuclides through analysis of those gamma rays that are emitted from individual samples. And we pop them in detectors. There's an example of this in the picture on the slide. We put a very small tube sample into this well detector that has a thick lead and copper shielding around it, and we analyze it in the detector for between 1 and 2 days to pick up even the smallest activity of some of the more rare radionuclides. And what that does is produce a spectrum of emitted gamma ray radiation that we can assign to different radionuclides in the environment. So what is cryoconite then? I said I would explain it in a bit more detail. Essentially, cryoconite is a sediment that is comprised, and it has to be comprised, of both organic and inorganic material. So what makes it different from just normal rocky sediment is that it has this organic component. And we find this all over the world in the cryosphere. And it's amazingly organic rich, and it's full of life. So because of that, we quite often think of cryoconite holes, the depressions in the ice where this dark material quite often pools, and when we think of them as being hotspots of biodiversity, and can be really quite unique. There are some estimates that suggest the amount of biodiversity on the surface of glaciers is bigger than what you would see in a lot of forests, for example. So really quite biodiverse environments, including things like tardigrades and other microbial life that we find there. But in addition to microbial life, it also contains obviously mineral matter. It does have components of the local geology, for example, black carbon that's been transported atmospherically, and also a range of contaminants from heavy metals to organic pollutants and other things. Cryoconite has been studied now for a couple of decades in detail, but largely from the perspective of the impact that it has on melting of the glacier surface. So it's a very, very dark black sediment. It's very fine, and for that reason, it doesn't protect the ice surface. It has the opposite effect. It changes the albedo considerably and enhances ice surface melting. So in places like the Greenland ice sheet, for example, cryoconite is very, very well studied from the perspective of its coverage to try and understand how that will impact and enhance how quickly the ice sheet is melting, particularly at the low elevation margins, such that we can actually see it from space as well. It really darkens the surface of the ice. And in the image on this slide on the left, you can see part of the glacier that's really quite dirty. It's like quite a different colour up above where I'm sampling, and that's covered by a thin layer of distributed cryoconite that causes more rapid melting in the environment. So in addition to all the microbial life, black carbon, mineral matter, what's also been shown relatively recently by Liz Bagshaw and others from a study in Antarctica was that cryoconite contains unusually high concentrations of carbon and nitrogen, and that it accumulates these in a much more high concentrations than other parts of the environment do. And it's theorized to thus be really quite an important component of the nutrient cycle. So just some photos now to just kind of give you a feel for what this environment looks like and the types of samples that we collected here. We focused on proglacial outwash, so that's that fine silty sediment that's transported downstream by glacier melt constantly, particularly in the summer in these latitudes. So we collected samples from proglacial outwash at both streams that exit the glacier at different points along the river, and collected samples from moraines, so those rocky boundaries of where the ice used to be, and in this case the moraines date to about 1910 when the glacier was at a much larger extent than it is today. Moraines are much more stable, and we don't expect the sediment to be particularly mobile in these locations, and actually often have a thin cover of vegetation, lichens and mosses, in addition to the rocky material too. We also took a lake core eventually. Initially, we wanted to do this by boat and carried this surprisingly heavy, rigid inflatable boat over a series of moraines to get into this lake in the hope that our gravity corer would work. But unfortunately, these glacial sediments are so fine and so dense that we didn't have enough weight for the corer to work. It would just fall over once we put it into the water. So instead, to retrieve the core, took a little bit of creativity and a set of waders. You can't see it in the pictures, but it was actually lightly snowing this day as well. But we did manage to retrieve our core, 37 centimetres. I'm not going to talk about it today because I don't have time, but we have managed to reconstruct a really nice chronology of sediment transport from the glacier into this proglacial lake as well, using gamma spectrometry to help us date the different horizons in that lake core. So a bit about the results of this work now. What we found, if you can see in the yellow column in the table on the right, is that some of the numbers are considerably larger than the others. And that column that signifies our cryoconite samples, the samples from the ice surface, are often 2 orders of magnitude higher than those that we detected in samples from moraines and proglacial outwash sediments and the lake core. So for example, if we look at lead-210, which is a natural radionuclide, it's naturally occurring but deposited atmospherically, we had a maximum amount of 14,500 becquerels per kilo in terms of radioactive content, in comparison to about 73 in the moraines and 87 in proglacial outwash, so considerably larger in this ice surface sediment. Cesium-137, which is one of the sort of radionuclides that we associate closely with Chernobyl, for example, and other nuclear events. The maximum that we recorded in cryokinite for this was 4,500 becquerels per kilo, and again, considerably larger than what we see in the downstream environment, where we have in the tens or low hundreds in terms of the radioactivity level there. What else we found, which was very interesting, was that the samples from the cryokinite, but also some samples from proglacial outwash, were quite rich in beryllium-7. And this is a different type of radionuclide, and it doesn't have a very long life. Basically, it's not present in the environment for very long once it's there. So we know that where we find beryllium-7, that these sediments must have been accumulated relatively recently, and they're quite mobile. So what this tells us is that those samples are interacting with meltwater frequently to pick up this content of beryllium-7. So just to illustrate this in a different way, the cryokinite is not shown on these. Let me see if I can turn on my laser pointer. There we are. The cryokinite isn't shown on these plots because it would dwarf the rest of the data. So this just shows samples from the central forefield of the glacier. So the land that's been exposed has been deglaciated many decades ago. 4 portions of the lake core going from the top down to the bottom, moraine samples in the second to the right column, and the proglacial outwash in the furthest right. And what this shows is that Cesium-137 is highest in the upper portions of the lake core, much higher than it is on other off-ice sediment sources, so the central forefield and then proglacial outwash. And this suggests that there might be some transport of radionuclide-enriched supraglacial, so ice surface sediments from the surface of the glacier down into the lake where it's accumulating. It was quite interesting to see that forefield in front of the glacier had such low levels of fallout radionuclides, despite the fact that it had been exposed to the air long before the weapons testing in Chernobyl era. So it was interesting to see that the sediments there were not accumulating radionuclides at anywhere near the same level as those sediments that come into contact with water more frequently. And we also, as I said before, really only found beryllium-7 in samples where meltwater flow is recent and active. So the proglacial outwash, like we see here, the upper lake core, are not shown on this figure, the cryokinite samples from the ice surface too. So these plots show the spatial variability in different radionuclides and also in the carbon and nitrogen content of the cryokinite samples. We took these in 2 transects across the glacier to see if elevation or aspect made any difference to the levels that we see. And what we've noticed is that, particularly if we look here and the levels of lead-210 and beryllium-7 in these samples, in the northernmost part of the ice, this corresponds to levels of carbon and nitrogen in the samples that are higher than the other samples, and that points towards organic content being really important for accumulation of radionuclides as well. And we think that makes sense because this side of the glacier is the sunniest side. It's the side that experiences the most shortwave radiation. It also experiences the most melt. So there's more meltwater being produced, and thus any sediment on the surface there is likely to come into contact with more meltwater than the more shady side of the glacier where we have much lower values. So that really points towards the importance of the level of organic content in the samples in terms of controlling how much radioactivity each of the samples contains. So why do fallout radionuclides accumulate in this ice surface sediment? As I said, cryokinite in the past has been shown to be very efficient at accumulating carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus as well. But our research really shows that the same is true, not just for fallout radionuclides, but we also looked at a range of other major and minor elements and found that a number of those were really quite elevated in our samples too. And we think that because these fallout radionuclides are old, they're historical contaminants that we can trace back to things like Chernobyl and weapons tests. they're stored and trapped inside the ice and snow, have recently been melted out, and as they're released and transported downstream, that meltwater interacts with this organic rich sediment that accumulates fallout radionuclides as it's transported downstream. So we think there's probably an element of bioaccumulation here, given the link between the organic content and the radioactivity levels, fed by a supply of meltwater that keeps that accumulating and topped up. There is a competing theory by a group in Austria that suggested that radionuclides build up in cryoconite directly over long periods of time. So assuming that these cryoconite holes sit as they are for many years and accumulate more and more radionuclides as they sit here. But these holes are filled with water, and the sediment, I can assure you as you go to collect it, is quite tricky. It moves very, very easily because it's very, very fine, so it's disturbed very easily. And when we have large melt events, when there's a lot of meltwater produced, we know now that cryoconite moves quite freely across the surface of the glacier. So this theory is unlikely to be true. And because our samples contain such high levels of beryllium-7, that further suggests that this is a young and mobile sediment. So that was a case study that we did in Sweden, really, when we first got interested in this topic, but which was really interesting in itself and really fun to do. But what we're really interested in is thinking about what that means from a global perspective in terms of downstream water quality in glacial catchments, particularly land terminating rather than ocean terminating glaciers. So I've teamed up with a number of researchers at other universities around the world to pull together data that we have on cryoconite from 22 different glaciers or areas of ice sheets such as Greenland. And this spans mountain glaciers, ice caps, ice sheets. We have Antarctica in our sample set as well, and a whole range of different climatological regimes from different latitudes across the globe. And in addition to cryoconite samples, we also have some sites with additional proglacial soils and sediments, so we can actually look at that sediment transport and the differences in accumulation as we move downstream through the proglacial system. So we have sites from South America, North America, Greenland, a few sites across Europe and Antarctica, and also in the future we have future field campaigns planned for Peru and also way up in the northeast of Greenland, hopefully next summer. So just to sort of flag up a few of the people that I work with on this, we have Will Blake, who I work with at the University of Plymouth. He's my main colleague and runs the Consolidated Radioisotope Facility here. Giovanni Baccalo, who's in Milan in Italy. Edita Lucas, who works at the Institute of Nuclear Physics in Poland, and Phil Owens, who's over in UNBC in Canada. So we've analysed quite a large number of samples across our different sites, up to 102 samples from Svalbard, so lots and lots of different cryoconite samples there. Some of the most recent samples we've had are from the Himalayas, from the Ladakh region, and from the Chilean Andes. And as I said, there are more to come, including our field trip to northeast Greenland that should have happened this summer, but obviously with the coronavirus situation, we weren't able to. So we'll be doing that next year. And I also have collaborators in Peru. This is Wilmer, who has been collecting cryoconite for me while I'm unable to get there myself. So it's fantastic to have such a supportive network of researchers helping with this as well. So some results from the global database that we've been putting together looking at these radionuclides. If we look at lead-210 first, so this is a natural radionuclide, we see that the levels are highest over northern Sweden, so actually from the sites that I've spoke about already, but also the sites that Phil Owens has looked at in Canada too. The highest average value over 9,000 becquerels per kilo, the highest single value of 14,500, and this is really, really high. It's really quite considerably higher than lots of other types of environmental matrices that are typically analysed for radionuclides. Coming into the artificial radionuclides or fallout radionuclides here, cesium-137, that, as I said before, a lot of this was deposited after Chernobyl. And it's particularly interesting in places like Sweden, where I've done work, because there was such a legacy of impact following that on reindeer meat and also wild boar. But even today, the Swedish government recently had a sort of sampling campaign where hunters were able to submit boar meat to be tested. And even just in the past couple of years, some wild boar meat in Sweden contains 10 times more than the legal limit of cesium in the meat, which means it's not able to be sold and used for consumption. So it is still important that this is in the environment. We think is one of the highest levels of radionuclides from cesium recorded outside of nuclear exclusion zones. So it's very, very high. And just to compare a little bit further in terms of regional variation, we have these really, really high values again in the European Alps, also in the Caucasus and Fennoscandia. But if we look at Iceland, it's a bit of an anomaly here because the levels are there, they're still high comparatively compared to other types of landscape, but much, much lower than the other sites we've looked at. I'm still doing analysis of these samples now to look at the organic content, but I theorise that this has something to do with the volcanic activity in Iceland and the impact that has on the organic content of the sediment there. And then finally coming to americium, which is another product of nuclear testing and nuclear energy, and it's a decay product of plutonium, and it has which has a half-life of 14 years. But americium, once that's produced through that decay, it has a half-life of 432 years. So it hangs around in the environment for a very long time. Now, while the absolute values in terms of becquerels per kilo for these are much, much lower, it's important to note that americium-241 is a strong alpha emitter and it's quite soluble as well. So in terms of if it's consumed, if it's taken up in the food chain, it can be particularly harmful. So key results sort of emerging from those studies are that certainly the fallout radionuclides are widespread across the global cryosphere, and we've found elevated levels in every single cryokinite sample that we've analysed, regardless of where that's been sampled. Cryokinite itself has exceptionally high levels of both natural and artificial radionuclides, and well above those that have been found in the past and things like lichens and mosses that are known to be efficient accumulators of radionuclides because of their reliance on atmospheric deposition. And also, we've found some of the highest levels recorded outside of nuclear exclusion zones in terms of levels found in the natural environment, which really highlights quite how unique and special cryokinite seems to be in its ability to accumulate anthropogenic contaminants within the sediment. So what are the impacts and potential applications of this? Obviously, there are concerns about this secondary contamination, so actually melt out of things like Chernobyl, fallout from decades ago, but occurring again now, and thinking about what impacts that might have downstream, particularly for aquatic life. But what we don't know is how much mass of fallout radionuclides there is. So while we know the levels are very, very high, this material tends to be quite distributed and quite isolated in terms of where it's found on the glacier surface. So we need to do a much more in-depth study of how much material there is so we can really assess whether there is any downstream impact at all. It's very much unknown. There are also ideas that we could maybe use cryokinite as a biomonitor for fallout radionuclides in the remote parts of the world where actually there just isn't very much vegetation, for example. Lichens and mosses tend to be used in other parts of the world as a monitor for what levels of radionuclides we have currently. But in places like Greenland and Antarctica, where vegetation is limited over large areas, perhaps cryokinite could offer a way for us to monitor that there. And I think in addition to expanding our database further, just trying to collect as much information we can on this, we'd like to look at things like sequential extraction and looking at how this is then taken up from cryokinite into flora and fauna as well, again, to think about assessing any potential harm it might cause. So very quickly, for the last 10 minutes, I'm not going to go into this in as much detail, but I just want to talk a little bit more about glaciers and how they interact with that water, food and energy security nexus. So this figure here shows really nicely, this is from the UN, shows really nicely this interlinkage between energy, food and water, and right at the centre of that we have people, ecosystems and landscapes. We spoke before about the pressures on that nexus from economic growth and population change, for example. But I would very much highlight here that I think to really tackle some of these issues, we have to take a very much interdisciplinary approach to our research, and also including the people that this impacts in terms of co-production of knowledge and actually creating our research alongside the stakeholders that this ultimately impacts. So how does this impact glaciers in the Peruvian Andes? So this is my other research site at the moment. It's a project that I've had funded for the past almost 2 years now, and will have for another couple of years, looking at downstream impacts of glacier change on water quantity and quality in the Andes. So about 10 million people here rely on glacier meltwater, which is a huge number. And in the Rio Santa catchment, where we're focusing, about 10 to 20% of annual river discharge comes directly from glacier meltwater. But during periods of drought, that's up to 90%. So it can be considerable. And in Peru, Peru is fantastic from the perspective of having such a large proportion of their energy from hydropower, about 50%. But that means that reduction in how much meltwater is available is also problematic for generation of energy here. And unfortunately, the Cordillera Blanca that contains these glaciers, it's the most glaciated tropical mountain range on Earth, but it has decreased in terms of ice-covered area by 35% in the last 40 years. So our project really tries to look at the Peruvian Andes and downstream impacts of glacier melt from a nexus perspective, and trying to build a decision support framework so that stakeholders can choose how they want to mitigate and adapt to these pressures on the nexus, particularly looking ahead to the post-peak water period where those resources will become less and less plentiful. But there are some pressures on the nexus that are perhaps slightly different in some other regions in this part of the world. I won't go through all of them here, but certainly we can include geopolitical conflict and corruption. In Peru, it's obviously quite unstable at the moment in terms of politics, with changes in leadership again there. But in addition to geopolitical issues, there are also a lot of natural pressures on the nexus, things like flooding from glacier lake outburst floods, earthquake activity and landslides. So lots of additional pressures that can cause issues in this region. So there are sort of 4 main work packages, and I'm not going to go into any of the results of our project now because we're still very much in the middle of it, and I've obviously been a little bit delayed and disrupted over the past 9 months or so because of the COVID situation. But the first part of our project is very much looking at water budget development, so thinking about glacier contribution, meteorological scale, event variability, and trying to apportion how much of the water downstream in the Rio Santa catchment can be attributed to glaciers, precipitation, snowmelt, and groundwater as well. We're also looking at basin connectivity in terms of sediment transport in particular, and how that might respond to a changing climate. And to do that, one of my students, Jess Kitch, is looking at sediment fingerprinting, and also looking at hydrological SWOT modelling to look at sediment transport, and also looking at future scenarios for what would happen. What happens if you remove the glaciers? What happens if you change this type of land use to something else? What impact would that have on sediment and water fluxes downstream? So we are using a sediment source apportionment model to do this, to try and look at the sources of sediment in the catchment and how important the glaciers are in generating and transporting sediment in the upper reaches too. So this is based on work by Will Blake that he's applied to a range of different catchments elsewhere. And And we sort of associate this as being a little bit like Cluedo. So sediment fingerprinting is really trying to understand what's happening in a catchment. So if we have two tributaries in our catchment, we have a red tributary and a blue one, but downstream there might be a sediment problem. Maybe a hydropower dam is suffering from siltation, for example. We want to know where that sediment's coming from. So if it's red, that's straightforward. We know it comes from the red subbasin, from Miss Scarlet, if you're a Cluedo player. If that sediment is blue, if that's a fingerprint it has, we know where that's come from as well. But what happens if it's purple? What happens if it's a mixture? It's not a purple sediment, it's not Professor Plum. It must be a mixture, and we have to use these unmixing models to try and unravel what we call these complex fingerprints downstream. So that's something that we're applying to the Rio Santa catchment too, to look at sediment apportionment. And the other thing that we're looking at from a physical science perspective is the natural and anthropogenic contaminant fluxes in the catchment. I've included this quite striking image here that shows very, very iron-rich water in a downstream river. Sometimes in this region, this is associated with mining activities, and quite often it's certainly blamed on mining companies, but the reality is that actually the local bedrock in this region can sometimes be very, very rich in heavy metals, and sometimes just glacial erosion and downstream transport is enough to turn the rivers into this quite striking colour, and even to the extent that it can result in pH being significantly reduced to being really quite acidic. But that is very much a natural process for the most part. So natural is almost as much of a challenge here as some of the anthropogenic pressures. So we're interested in fallout radionuclides, as we have been in other areas, but also on things like heavy metals and microplastics that we might find in these environments too. So it's quite a wide-ranging project, and there are lots and lots of collaborators, both from the UK and multiple institutions in Peru that we're working on together in this project over the next couple of years. And the final part, just before I wrap up, is just to really highlight the importance of stakeholder engagement for these types of projects too. Ultimately, in this region, we know that locals have a bit of research fatigue because so many projects have studied this part of the Peruvian Andes. There are, I think, well over 150 hydrological papers alone looking at the Rio Santa. But this very rarely filters down to policy change or filters back to the people that have contributed maybe local opinion. And we know that this is becoming a frustration in the region. So this final work package is really core to our project. And for that reason, we're working with social scientists to help us understand what the priorities of the local people are, how they feel about changes to the environment there, and thus hopefully mean that there's more local buy-in to mitigation strategies in the future too. And we're doing that through trialling a new payment for ecosystem service model in the region that's very much still in development as well. And in addition to this, we're also hoping to contribute to outreach and education through our project as well. And I've done this recently by creating a tool called Glacier Map. You can take part yourself. This is for anyone to use, everything from school kids all the way up to retired people, anyone who wants to join in. The website is peruglaciers.org. And this allows people to map glacier change from Landsat satellite imagery of the Cordillera Blanca in Peru. So we have essentially crowdsourcing or a citizen science project that helps us to understand how rapidly the glaciers are changing there, and in doing so help to distribute knowledge and improve education around glacier change in the region. So to wrap up, 3 take-home messages. The first is that I think that glacier-fed water security is absolutely crucial for the water, food and energy security nexus, and that's particularly true for regions like the Andes and the Himalayas. Take-home message 2 is that water quality has to be considered at least as much as water quantity. particularly because we know that glaciers are nothing more than temporary stores for legacy historical contaminants. So we know that whatever's stored in those now will make its way downstream at some point. The glaciers are very rarely growing. The vast majority of glaciers on Earth are doing the opposite to that. So we really have to consider water quality in glacier-fed regions too. And the third take-home message is that we also have to consider the socio-environmental impacts and stakeholder perspectives when we're doing these types of research projects in order to really try and make a difference and come up with ways to mitigate changes to water availability and to water quality too. So with that, I will wrap up, and I think I'm on time, which is amazing. So thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, thank you very much, Caroline, for such a multiple aspects lecture. We learned a lot from this, and we have a couple of questions for you from our participants. And the first question is from a researcher from I don't know how to pronounce it right, Institute of I don't know, sorry, I'm not sure that I know this abbreviation. So this researcher is from Moscow, and he'd like to know what sort of bacteria do you observe in glacier water, and where do bacteria usually concentrate in organic-rich cryoconite?
That's a really good question, and I do not have the answer for it. I'm not a microbiologist at all. There are some fantastic papers out there that you could look up if you're interested. You can look at papers by a researcher called Arwen Edwards, who's at Aberystwyth University. There's also, and I'm not going to be able to pronounce his name, Krzysztof Zarowska. I'm not sure exactly what his name is, but he looks at things like tardigrades and other biological material in cryoconite as well. But yeah, it's not my field of expertise, I'm afraid.
Right. Okay, thank you very much. And one more question from me. So you said that there is no studies about relations between radionuclides concentration in ice and in glaciers and rivers downstream. Is it real truth? I mean, a lot of people supplied with water from glaciers and they drink it, but how much do we know about origin of this water and how it could impact our health, for example, not our but people in Sweden, etc., and other countries?
Yeah, there really is very little information as far as I'm aware. So in terms of studies on cryoconite, there are now a number looking at individual glacier sites, and my colleagues and I are hoping to publish our work soon on the global perspective as well. Fallout radionuclides and gamma spectrometry have been used in the past to date ice cores, for example. So people have done studies taking portable spectrometers into the field to try and get horizon dates in ice cores, for example. But to my knowledge, that really hasn't been translated into how much is being transported downstream. So I think there's only one or two studies at the moment that actually have published data from both the glacier and downstream sediments. So yeah, very, very little knowledge. If there's anything, I know that some work has been done actually from some researchers in Russia. Someone sent me the best translation they could manage. So sometimes you find that there are other studies that have been done elsewhere that maybe aren't in the English written literature that I don't know about. So if anyone does know of any, I'm really interested to hear about, because I'm trying to gather as much information as I can about this.
Okay, thanks. And one more question about bacteria. Pankaj Kumar would like to know what harm these glacial bacteria cause to human. Are they really important?
I don't know again about the sort of bacteria within the cryoconite, but in terms of the radionuclides, in small quantities, we all consume radionuclides, whether they're fallout radionuclides or cosmogenic. We're constantly being bombarded by cosmogenic radionuclides, and on the whole, they're not harmful. However, it's ingestion of some of these things that can become a problem. So if you eat reindeer meat that's contaminated by it, for example, or fish, or drink water that has a particularly high concentration, that's where the problem can lie. But we just don't know yet, because we don't know what the mass of cryoconite is and how that translates in terms of downstream dilution. It's just, we just don't know essentially yet if that's actually harmful. But what I wouldn't suggest, I don't think I would think again before I drink water from the surface of a glacier, which I've always done on field work. I always, you don't carry your water bottle, you take it up there with you and fill it up with a stream. And I have to say, I would think twice about doing that again now.
Yeah, the same. When you study water quality, you always think
Yeah.
about yeah. Gay, would you like to ask something? Do you have some questions?
No.
So I think
say thank you, Caroline.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. Thanks again for attending this meeting, for this opportunity, and for our participants. And we have about 10 minutes before the start of the third talk at this session. I think we should start at a time, right?
Yeah. We should make a break now on the translation on the YouTube. Yes, and then so
we'll continue.
We stop now.
Yeah, let's have a Let me introduce you. Sage is right, yeah? I pronounced it right, or Sage is right? Sorry, I'm not good.
Yeah, you first, Sagi, yeah.
Okay, so, thank you. Dear participants, we're continuing now with the third amazing talk of Sagi Cohen, Associate Professor of the University of Alabama. And Sagi's primary scientific interest is modeling and analysis of hydrogeomorphic processes and dynamics in large global rivers. And he's also leading research and development efforts focusing on flood remote sensing, analysis, and modeling. You have about 45 minutes for your lecture, and then we have 15 more minutes for answering questions that would be written on YouTube, and I will transfer it to you.
Thank you.
So please start, Sigi.
Yeah, I'll share my screen. Let's see. Where's my screen? Here it is. You see it all right?
Yeah, that's good.
All right. So, well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers and especially Sergey, who invited me. This is one of the silver lining of the COVID pandemic, is to see all these initiatives pop up, which allow people from all over the world really to come together for free, basically, right? Or very, very cheaply. And I hope this is one of the things that is going to remain after we go back to normal, because I've been a part of some of these and even helped organize a few, and it's really great. So anyway, well done, and congratulations on a successful workshop. Today I want to talk about more general about recent advances and future direction in global fluvial sediment modeling. So this is a topic that I've been working on for quite a few years now. So I'm going to start with some introduction, which I like to put in terms of a question. So why should we care about fluvial sediment? And I'm sure the answer is clear to many of you, but nevertheless, I think it's good to spend a couple of minutes thinking about that. I'm then going to very quickly talk about some of the main mechanisms and drivers of fluvial sediment dynamics, at least the one that are most related to my work at that scale. And finally, I'm going to talk about global fluvial sediment modeling, both a little bit about past or the evolution of that field, what we've been doing recently, and then looking at some future directions and very recent publication that came out by different people. I like to start my talks with this image that I generated in Google Earth. So Google Earth, I'm sure all of you, or most of you are familiar with it, allow you to basically patch together all these satellite images. And in this case, you see, I usually ask people, which river basin are we looking at? And some people can guess correctly, but because we don't have that interaction here, I'm going to tell you that this is the Amazon basin, looking from the outlet, from east to west in this oblique view. So the north be north here. So we see, the reason why I like to show this picture, first of all, it's kind of beautiful, I think, but it encompasses a lot of the processes and dynamics that I'm going to talk about. And if you know what to look for, you can actually see a lot of things just even from that really large scale image from space. And in the right corner, under bottom right, you see an actual picture that was taken, I believe, from the International Space Station. And you can see the sediment plume. So this is the outlet over here. This is the delta. And you can see the sediment plume coming out of the Amazon River, and which you can't see looking at the Google Earth image, just because they mask the ocean. Anyway, so what can we see here in the Amazon? So we see quite clearly a lot of sediment, right? Even from space, we can see the sediment within the river system, which is quite amazing. Obviously, the biggest river in the world, but we can also see there's a lot of heterogeneity and a lot of dynamics here. So one thing that I like to highlight is the Rio Negro basin here. You can see this black spot, this black line. This is the Rio Negro River, which has very little sediment load in it for different reasons, which I'm not going to go into. So already we see extreme sediment condition within this one big basin. We can also, if we know what to look for, we can see the source of much of the sediment in the Amazon basin, which is the Andes River mountain range that you can see sort of in the far distance, this brownish area, some white spot, which is snow. So a lot of the sediment that flows through the Amazon is coming from the upstream area, headwater area of the Andes mountain range. So it makes a long journey all the way to the coast. We also see the effect of humans on this basin very clearly, again, if we know what to look for, in the form of deforestation on land use change, right? You see all these areas all over, especially in the south part of the Amazon basin, a lot of land clearing. This is something that a lot of people have been looking at, and there's a lot of studies that have been done. It's a major concern. In the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of forest fires in the Amazon basin. Anyway, so what I'm trying to convey to you here is all these processes, all the way from the landscape, the hill slope, to the fluvial within the river system, and then finally at the coastal, what's going on once the river hit the ocean. So as I said, I like to frame my introduction in the form of a question. Why is fluvial sediment important? Why should we care, right, about all of that? And especially, why do we want to model that? So I like to split it into three domains or three environments: the landscape, the river, and the coastal / marine environment. So for the landscape, you just heard a talk about Gully, right? So generally speaking, we know that the process of sediment transport starts with the production of sediment or production of soil through weathering and so the pedogenesis, the process in which rock becomes soil, and then through soil erosion is delivered into the river system and is transported eventually to the coast or a big lake, or deposited on the floodplain. So the fluvial sediment component, which is in this diagram or this flow chart, is the last component, which is actually not really, but the fluvial part of that process is in itself indicative of what's going on at the hill slope upstream of it. So we can use the changes and characteristics of fluvial sediment to tell or to gain information about processes at the landscape, on the landscape, and at the floodplain. So at geological timescales, we can look, for example, at deposition in floodplains to understand long-term processes and changes on the landscape. In more recent timescales, we can look at observations or modeling of fluvial fluxes to understand how changes, for example, in land use or climate change are reflected in sediment flux in rivers. In addition, the sediment itself is a major conduit of nutrient, carbon, and pollution. So there's a lot of direct impact or a lot of direct links between the sediment flux and what's going on in the aquatic environment, so ecological water uses and so on. Now, in terms of riverine, that's a more direct link, obviously, because we're talking about fluvial sediment, so obviously it has an effect on the river itself. So the morphology of the river itself is controlled to a large degree by the characteristics of sediment. So how much sediment we have, the particle size of the sediment, the flow regime, and so on. So a lot of it is controlled by the actual fluvial sediment. So just in terms of fluvial geomorphology, then understanding fluvial sediment flux is extremely important. In the field of aquatic ecology, then the functioning of a river system as an ecological environment also is directly linked to fluvial sediment, both in terms of bed morphology, so different type of or species of aquatic animal like fish, you know, and so on, dependent on very specific niches or bed morphology to reproduce, as an example. So understanding sediment within river system is very important for that. Also, the sediment load in river, some or many aquatic species are very sensitive to very specific turbidity in the water and so on. There's also river systems are major socioeconomic services, so transportation, recreation, fisheries, and so on. Water use, obviously, irrigation, drinking water. And sediment is a major factor in all of these. So we're going to talk a lot about dams in the rest of this talk. And then recreation also, again, related to a lot of other factors as well. And so there's not much to expand on this, but what I'm trying again to convey is why are we interested in fluvial sediment? So I showed you the Rio Negro and the Amazon and how different they are. So this is, I like to show this picture and I kind of zooming in. There's a city called Manaus in Brazil that you see over here, and it sits on the confluence of the Rio Negro and the Amazon. And so that extreme contrast between these two rivers and the confluence of them is actually became a major tourist attraction over the last decades. And people actually go on cruises to see that line between the Rio Negro water and the Amazon, which is very brown and heavy in sediment load. And it's such an extreme contrast that it's very cool. The temperature is very different as well. So the density of the water is different. Different aquatic animal can thrive in different parts. So this is all in the same location. You can sort of see it over here. And it's actually very interesting from many perspectives, including from fluvial geomorphology, because it takes a long time for the two rivers to actually fully mix. You can actually see, if you look closely, and I hope you can see that, but there's actually this line between them continue for dozens of kilometers downstream until it's fully mixed, because there's such contrasting body of waters. So just an example here, right, of geomorphology, socioeconomy, aquatic, all in one compact location. Okay, so I want to talk about, sorry, before I move on to the processes, I forgot this last bit, which is the coastal and marine environment. So again, the question is, why do we care about fluvial sediment? Because, and this is the third element, which is it has a major impact on the coast and the marine environment. And there's a lot of factors there. So obviously, the sediment characteristics of a river has a major impact of its coastal morphology in the, near its outlet. And some of the best examples of that are obviously river deltas, but that's also in places where you don't have developed deltas, then the beach geomorphology and the continental shelf are all responsive or in some sort of equilibrium with the sediment that comes out of their nearest river. Deltas are perhaps the most dynamic of those in many cases, because delta is basically the equilibrium or the results of the balance between the amount of sediment that comes out of the river and the energy that comes from the ocean, so that these two processes are actually affecting each other very significantly. And the ecosystem, again, we always go to ecosystem. Ecosystem in the coastal environment are also very directly linked to marine environments. And that is because Sediment itself, as we said, brings a lot of nutrients. It affects water quality, both in terms of pollution and turbidity and so on. So marine ecosystem very much related to the amount of, or in the characteristics of fluvial sediment. And finally, socioeconomic, just like in river system, the socioeconomy of coastal areas are also can be greatly impacted by fluvial sediment. Actually, a couple of years ago, I spent a sabbatical at the University of Hawaii and learned a lot about the link between fluvial sediment and the marine environment. And there it's a kind of a double whammy. First of all, they have the impact on coral reefs, which is not unique to Hawaii, but it's definitely a very significant process that raised a lot of concern with sedimentation of fluvial sediment that basically choke up or bury coral reefs. Recreation, as you can imagine, Hawaii is mostly related on tourism. And when you have very heavy sediment load, as you see in this picture at the bottom, they call it actually brown water day, and they close the beach in some beaches quite several times a year because of these heavy sediment loads that come to the beaches, and that has a significant economic impact on these islands. All right, the next topic I want to talk about very quickly, I'm sure many of you are aware of a lot of that, is the main mechanism and drivers that control fluvial sediment. And again, this is very, very quick and dirty overview. And again, not a lot of surprises there, right? But we need to, especially when we go into the modeling of this, there's several processes and drivers that we need to consider. The first being atmospheric, right? Because everything is driven by water. So the hydrological cycle, which is in our case starts with atmospheric processes, is key to everything. Without understanding and without representing water cycle within our river system, then we don't have a chance of representing sediment. And therefore we need to know something at least about especially precipitation. At the hill slope scale, we want to know about soil production. We want to know about the movement or the initial movement of that soil through soil erosion. So these are the drivers that affect how much sediment and what is the characteristics of that sediment that goes into the hill slope. And finally, the fluvial itself. So the hydrology and hydraulics. So both the basin scale, sort of water cycle, as we said, or hydrology, but also the in-channel hydraulics, right? Because what's going on within the channel itself is actually very impactful in terms of sediment flux and deposition and bed load and all these other factors that I'm going to quickly talk about. The river morphology can affect fluvial sediment flux. And finally, flooding. We don't always, or not all of us always think about flooding constantly, but flooding or the extreme hydrological conditions are actually very, very important to the story of sediment flux, because flooding can be an extremely or exceptionally effective mechanism to move sediment and to change sediment and morphology dynamics. So flooding, a very difficult component or part of the hydrological cycle to model and to capture and to even to study and to observe, but very important for the fluctuation of sediment in the fluvial system. Now these pictures, this is a creek in near the University of Hawaii in Manoa, which is on the island of Oahu near Honolulu. And you can see Hawaii is a really great example of all of these processes, because much of the sediment, so at the bottom where you see the river or this creek during normal times, which is very low water level, almost no sediment loading, even though this is a very steep creek. But then every couple of weeks you get this big storm come in, and there's all this water, all this soil erosion, and all that sediment, as you can see here, in flowing through that river system, that little creek. We can also see human impacts here. You see this excavator here. You see this banking, this armoring of the bank. It's hard to see the hill slope processes, but everything is all very much connected in a very small package, which is Hawaii. The last mechanism that I want to talk about is anthropogenic. I'm going to talk a lot about in terms of the different studies that we've been doing, but humans are a major force, as we all know, in terms of global change, but also very specifically to sediment. And that's because we do a lot to our river systems, but also to the landscape. So there's actually a conflicting sort of processes or drivers that we humans, our societies are doing. On one hand, we dam the rivers, right? We build dams on the rivers, which are very efficient in terms of trapping sediment, so preventing sediment from flowing through our river system. But we also, through land use, change the soil erosion energy and soil erosion rates. And therefore, all of these processes may conflict with each other, which makes it even more difficult to understand and to model. But humans, especially in the last 200 years, have been a major driver of changes in sediment flux in rivers. So taking all of that and try to create models to predict that can be quite challenging, as you can imagine. Like any other field of environmental science, right? You're trying with numerical models, you're trying to represent a very complex system within some mathematical rules within a computer program. So as a result, there's been a lot of significant evolution of numerical modeling of fluvial sediment over the years. There's a large variety of concepts and scales of application. Traditionally, it's been linked to soil erosion estimation. That's been sort of the roots of fluvial sediment modeling can be linked to soil erosion modeling, because especially since the mid 20th century, so that you had the Dust Bowl in the US in the 1930s that brought a lot of attention to soil erosion in the US, and it was a big boost to trying to model soil erosion. And these days, or still, we are heavily relying on empirical relationship between observations and processes within the catchment and the river. The problem that we face with using empirical links is the fact that we don't have enough observation of sediment globally. The US is probably the richest location in terms of the extent of continental or near continental scale, with relatively a lot of monitoring of sediment, but that's is definitely not the case in a lot of other countries and a lot of other regions. There have been a lot of review papers that have been published over the years looking at soil erosion modeling and river modeling and fluvial sediment modeling, a lot less for fluvial sediment modeling, actually. So this paper that I took this from is from Devante at 2013. And the reason why I put this here and kind of advertise this paper, I wasn't a co-author on it or anything like that, is because they, I think, were the first one, and I don't think there's been much since, to look at what they call regional soil yield or sediment yield models, sediment erosion and transport models. So they compare these models that you see here. Some of them are global in scale. Actually, I believe these four, but among them is the WBM SED, which is my model that I'm going to talk a lot about. But we're also going to talk about the Bogart equation. I also would want to draw your attention to the Peltier at 2012 model, another good one. At the time, these two, the Peltier and WBM SED, were the only sort of global sediment, fluvial sediment transport models that's been around. Since then, there's been quite a revival of that topic, and I'm going to talk about it at the end of my presentation. So I need to take a move on. So the Bogart equation, or BQart equation, was first fully published in 2017 by Savitsky and Milliman. And it's a really nice, I think this is the first global sediment flux model, and it predicts sort of long-term average sediment load at the outlet of a river as a function of discharge, which is over here, area, relief, temperature, sediment trapping behind reservoir, anthropogenic erosivity, lithology is a proxy for sediment production rate, and ice cover, because ice is also very important, as we heard. Now, following on the Savitsky and Milliman, so I was the lead, or still am the lead, on the development of the WBM SED model, which basically took the Bogart equation as the governing equation and express it in a spatially and temporally explicit global scale modeling framework. It was part of a larger hydrological framework that was developed at the time. And it includes both suspended and bed load. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And it can also be applied regionally. It doesn't have to be global scale. So again, it used the Bogart equation as its governing equation, and then break it down using the Psi model into daily predictions. I would refer you to the 2013 paper we published. This was the first paper that kind of showed that concept behind this model. The model used or builds on an existing global hydrology model called WBM+, which is a really good model, not well enough known in my view, because the reason why it's good and kind of is different than others, it has all of these anthropogenic factors already built into this model. So we were very fortunate to be able to build our sediment component within this framework. So you have irrigation and recharge of groundwater, uptake of reservoir water, crops, all the different component, dam operation to affect reservoirs. So all that effect there, I'm going to skip over that. And a lot of this was also explained in our 2014 paper. I'm going to skip that slide. I'm a little behind on where I want to be. So the model, I'm going to show you some application of this model. So just to give you a sense, we run this model at 6 arc-minute resolution, which is about 11 kilometers grid cells. It takes about less than an hour to simulate 1 year at the daily time frame. We use a high-performance computer cluster, but you can run it on on a strong desktop if you have it. You don't have to have a supercomputer. However, it does have a very significant input data set, and it generates very large output data sets, so you need a lot of disk space. So that's one of the advantages of using a high-performance computer cluster. These are just some example of running it at much higher resolution regionally. So you see here the island of Oahu in Hawaii at 30-meter resolution. I simulated Australia at 15 arc-second, the part of the US, and so on. So you can apply it at much higher resolution regionally if you need to and want to. All right, let's talk about some application. One of the big advantages of using models in general and global fluvial sediment model in particular is our ability to isolate different parameters and also look into the future, into the past, where we don't have observations. So I want to show you some example of that. And I'm going to start with a study we did as part of a master thesis in my lab that looks at anthropogenic impact. We actually now have a PhD project that's moving way beyond what I'm going to present to you today. But I kind of mentioned before that humans have a conflicting effect on fluvial sediment flux. On one hand, we're very efficient at trapping sediment behind dams, but we have also caused a lot of increase in erosion. So what is the net impact of that? There have been some estimates at the past that put the net impact as 30% reduction in global sediment flux to the ocean. That was for Voris-Marti estimate in 2003. There's also been an estimate for discharge, a decrease of 3.5 in water discharge to the ocean, again, on a global scale average because of human activity. So with our modeling capability, we can actually test these and create an exercise in which we can control this different aspect of the anthropogenic factors and therefore isolate them and see how they behave. So for example, in this case, we see, all right, what happens if we switched off or remove all the dams and also look at natural land use? So what is going to be the impact? So we compare that to what we call the disturb simulation, which is the most realistic one. And then what happened if we just look at the effect of land use? What happened if we just look at the impact of dams? So as you can see, just from these maps, it's a very complex story, right? Different rivers behave in different ways. You can average that globally. And what we did in this, just to make it a little bit simpler, is to average that per continent. So we took different continents so at the top table, you see, okay, what is the percent difference between the pristine and the trapping? So if we just put the reservoir, so if we remove the reservoirs or the dams, then you get a huge increase in sediment in Asia, more moderate one in North America and in Europe, and even more moderate in South America and Africa and Oceania, where you don't have as many reservoir. And then you can look at what is the net impact. And what's interesting is Asia here. And, you know, you should take this with a grain of salt. Obviously, there's a lot of complexities that are not represented. But Asia, even though the impact of dams is huge in trapping sediment, the net effect is very close to zero, because humans are also increasing the amount of erosion very actively because of population density and somewhat lack of soil conservation compared to other countries. But you can see, so for in Europe and in North America, you get quite a very significant decrease in the amount of sediment that flows to the oceans. Another example, which I really like, this was a couple of papers that were published very recently, the last couple of years, by Frances Dunn, who at the time was a PhD student at the University of Southampton in the UK. Now she's a postdoc in the Netherlands. And what she did, she used the model, again, with a somewhat similar or more extensive scenarios of testing. And she looked at to the future, by the way, so the end of the 21st century, and she looked at different RCP. So these are the global climate change model, right? The general circulation models that are used to project the future climate. She looked at the 4 different scenarios, so business as usual, all the way to very effective reduction in greenhouse gases, and also 3 socioeconomic scenarios, so increase in population, development, and so on. And she made some predictions about, or through that, she was able to isolate and predict the future of sediment flux into large river deltas. And I'm not going to go into the whole, again, very complex story here. I would refer you to these 2 papers. I think they're really good papers if you're interested. And generally, just to give you the punchline, if you will, so we do see a mean and maximum decline of 38 and 83 respectively. So an average decline of 38% towards the end of the 21st century in terms of the amount of sediment that flows into these 47 deltas. And that's a big story. That's a big prediction, because the deltas are very sensitive to the amount of sediment, as we said, and a reduction in sediment flux into deltas is bad news to a lot of these deltas. And building off that, this is a PhD project in my lab by Danuk Monashinge. And he's looking now at the next step, which is what is the actual impact of reducing sediment flux on deltas. So he's using remote sensing to actually map and quantify changes in the river delta morphology. So in this picture here, you see one of the distributaries of the Nile River Delta. We talked about the Nile a little bit. And you see the lines here are the coastline going back to 1973 all the way to 2014. And you see that erosion on the delta. And that's because the Nile has seen a massive reduction in the amount of sediment since the establishment of the Aswan Dam. another very recent paper just published this year by my PhD student Nishani Moragoda, and she was, what we did was isolate the climate signal. So we took an ensemble of 5 GCM, so these general circulation models, and all these 4 RCP, and we said, okay, if we just look at climate change towards the end of the 21st century, how is that going to impact discharge and sediment flux in global rivers? And again, the picture is quite complex, obviously, in different regions. Generally, we do see an increase, again, just because of climate change in sediment and discharge, which is not surprising because we do expect more precipitation in the future because of global warming and therefore more atmospheric moisture and so on. But we also found one of the takeaway from this study was that the differences between the scenarios are pretty significant, especially for discharge, but also for sediment. So this is the percent difference from the start of the 21st century or for the average then at the end, the last decade. So, you know, over 15% more sediment and 10% more discharge at a global scale. Actually, the averaging doesn't really tell a very compelling story in a way because the effect in different basins can be very, very dramatic. This study, I just want to show it in passing. First, because we haven't really published it beyond just an abstract, but also because I think this is a really cool study. And what we are doing here is isolating the impact of tropical cyclones on discharge and sediment. So this is a really cool application of this model, I think, because what we've done, this is my colleagues at the University of Southampton, we basically took the precipitation input that we have for the model, extract the precipitation that is associated with tropical cyclones using the tropical cyclone track data set, and then compare the sediment and discharge water discharge prediction between the 2 scenarios, right? The realistic and the one without the tropical cyclone. And then we can quantify the contribution of tropical cyclones to sediment flux. Now, again, the story, when you average it out, it doesn't look very dramatic about, about 2% contribution globally, but the effect on specific river systems can be very, very dramatic. We found that especially in Northern Australia, that's where we found very, very significant contribution. So again, trying to quantify the contribution of tropical cyclone, and that is a really nice exercise, but also is important to talk about the future and the impact of climate change, because we know, or the main hypothesis that or the notion that we now have, that global warming will increase the intensity of tropical cyclones. So by understanding how they actually affect global sediment flux, that's another piece of that puzzle. Another application, another paper that I would like to advertise, this was published in 2019. Jaya Savitsky was the lead author on this. This is, I think, a really, really important paper, because what it looked on was the contribution or the effect or the relevance of river temperature to fluvial sediment. And the reason why it's important is because river temperature, water temperature can change dramatically even within a river basin, but definitely globally, and also seasonally, it can change dramatically, especially for rivers that flow along latitudes from south to north, or from north to south, or from very high elevation to low elevation, which many rivers do as well. So here, for example, we see the temperature profile of the Mississippi River that change in terms of average temperature by over 10 degrees, 12 degrees C on average. This is the Lena here, which is less dramatic in terms of temperature change on average. But you can see some major jump, especially when you have tributaries coming in. And the reason why this is I think a really important study and very interesting is because water temperature has a major impact on water viscosity, density, and settling velocity, and therefore the amount of sediment that the water can carry. So what we have found in this paper is that well, first of all, it's known that these models, even high-resolution models, they basically completely neglect temperature. And what we demonstrate in this paper that we shouldn't, because water temperature actually exerts very significant impact on sediment flux, which is a parameter that we just ignored so far. I mentioned that we are we added a bed load component to the WBM SED model, and this is a paper I'm currently working on. For the sake of time, I'm actually going to move on just because this is, and I'm just going to mention the particulate nutrient component that we have for the model. We used what's called the global news model that was published in 2010. And it has a bunch of equations that we just plugged into the WBM SED model, and we can have a fairly robust prediction of particulate nutrient, organic carbon, and phosphorus. All right, so that was the sort of where we are or where we were with the WBM SED model. I want to finish this presentation by looking at some really exciting new developments. So as I mentioned earlier, there's been a renaissance in global fluvial sediment modeling in the last just couple of years. And a lot of it come from the availability of data, but also I think much of it is driven by the Earth system models. So Earth system models are these models that's trying to, well, model the entire Earth system. So linking the atmosphere and the oceans and the landscape or the continents all together. And up till just, as I said, a couple of years ago, rivers were pretty much ignored. And now there's this renaissance and people try to do that. One of the leading authors is called Ji Tang, and he published this paper in 2018. I think it was his first paper about this. And this paper focused about, they were trying to identify the best model to use to plug into what's called the Energy Exascale Earth System Model, E3SM. This is probably the best known Earth system model, especially in the US. It was developed and funded by the US Department of Energy. And G10 has developed a sediment component. He found out that the Morgan equation or model actually was the best one. It's actually here. So he's been using it, plugging it into his model, and got really interesting results. Another really cool paper that was just published by a group from Japan, Hatono and Yoshimura, and they developed, again, a global sediment flux model that not only look at what's going on at the landscape of how much sediment is coming to the river system, they actually model the fate or the processes within the channel itself in terms of erosion and deposition of sediment within the channel, which I think was really interesting. And they got very good results as well. So another paper to be aware of. And again, all of these things are coming now up front. It was pretty lonely, I can tell you, for a long time when it comes to global sediment model. Another two examples that are exciting and new. So Baroli et al. Published this global soil erosion paper, soil erosion model based on the RUSLE equation. And it was a static model, to my understanding, at least initially, but it was very high resolution, 250 meter resolution. And so they provide basically soil erosion at the landscape, and that allow people like Gully et al. That published a paper last year in Nature called Mapping the World Free-Flowing Rivers to try to use that to flow that soil erosion into the river system and understand or try to create an index of how pristine are all the rivers around the world. Another paper really worth getting to know. So yeah, I'm really good on time, I see. So this is pretty much my last slide. And I want to talk about the future very quickly, at least the way I see it. And obviously, different people have different prospects. So with all this exciting new development that's been coming online just in the last couple of years, what we are working on, and I think this is that other people are working on as well, is to move from maybe more toward physically based understanding, or at least more explicit modeling of sediment transport within the river system. So empiricism is good, but it has a lot of limitation. And we need to start linking more explicitly within these global models, the landscape processing. So again, we heard about gullying, but soil erosion in general, landslides, and all these other factors that affect sediment dynamics within the basin. So the time is now right to put all of these together within a model. It was not very feasible just recent up till now. So but there's still a lot of work to be done. So linking all of these small scale hill slope and fluvial processes into a basin scale understanding of sediment dynamic. One of the big things that we need to work on is really do a good job at linking or understanding the interconnectivity between climate and anthropogenic modification of the landscape. So I showed you that paper that we published about isolating climate change. I also showed you a paper about looking at, or a couple of papers looking at anthropogenic effect. However, everything is connected, right? So climate affects how human behaves and how they modify the landscape and how they interact with the landscape and damming and everything. So everything is connected, which makes it difficult. But this is, if we want to understand the future, I think we need to go beyond just plugging in those things individually and try to find the interconnectivity. Extreme hydrological events, as I said, are very difficult to model, and especially their effect of sediment, because observations are really sparse. However, we know that floods, especially in many river systems, are very, very significant control on sediment dynamics. So this is a very much a future direction that needs to be taken. And then I want to finish that with looking at nutrients and carbon. I call it the so what kind of result. So, all right, we all are sort of embedded within the sediment part of the story, but really sediment in itself is interesting, but what are the impact, which is how I started, so it kind of closing the loop on my talk. Nutrients and carbon are things that affect ecosystem, atmospheric systems, and so on. So we need to link everything together within this modeling system. And again, these Earth system models are a good way to do that. So, smack on time. If you have any more questions, feel free to email me, obviously now, but I'm very happy to answer your emails. Also, you can check out some of my publications on my website. And that's it. That's what I had.
Thank you, Seigi, for such a really global talk. That's such a planetary point of view. And we have a couple of questions. And the first question is from Pankaj Kumar. The question is, why intermixing, even after dozens of kilometers, doesn't happen between the streams? There must be enough turbulence.
Well, it's because, to my understanding, okay, I should put some caveat, I didn't study it myself, but for my understanding, a lot of it has to do with the water density that's so different. The temperature between the two streams is very significantly different. And I believe the Rio Negro, well, you know what, I don't want to say which is which, but I think that's the main story. So it just takes a while. You have this sort of barrier there that takes a while to mix. And it's not unique to the Rio Negro. You see that a lot in river confluences, but it's just such an extreme example because one river is so heavy on sediment load and so it's so poor or so little sediment load, and it's obviously two very large rivers.
Yeah, thank you very much. In Russia, we have one more great example of confluencing rivers with different density. This is the confluence of the Volga and the Oka. The Volga is dammed and the Oka is a free-flowing river, and they do not mix, I think, more than 200 kilometers. They flow, yeah, separately. It's great. It's really great, amazing natural event. So one more question is, from me. It's very interesting and a bit. It's really worrying how rivers lose their deltas, because there are a lot of people live, especially in Asia, in deltas. So people lose their homes. But as I know, there are and not to remove dams. I mean, or maybe just change management regime or something. I think it's possible to study using models or I don't know.
Yeah. So yeah, you're right. Well, first of all, I didn't go into that at all, but deltas are extremely complex systems. So there's a lot going on. You're absolutely right. Extremely important. Hundreds of millions of people live in deltas. Deltas are kind of bread baskets for a lot of communities in a lot of countries, because they can be extremely productive in terms of agriculture because of all the sediment and nutrients that come into them. There's also a lot of subsidence that happens in river deltas because of groundwater uptake and buildings and compaction of deltas. And if you couple that with the erosion of deltas because of lack of sediment, one of the inverse impact is increased susceptibility to flooding in river deltas, because you basically you lower the delta by different processes. You starve it of sediment, there's compaction, as I said, and so on, and sea level is rising. So everything together is a big concern for people living in deltas. Now, in terms of recovering deltas, there's a lot of things that have been done all over the world. One is trying to sort of armor the delta, right? So you put protection to try to reduce the erosion of the delta channels or coast. So you actively you put levees or whatever it is to try to shield the delta from erosion. And that's been happening all over the world. One of the best examples when you talk about trying to recover a delta is the Mississippi Delta, because the Mississippi, not surprising, because of all the engineering that's been going on for, over 100 years, in the Mississippi, dams and armoring and levees and so on, the Mississippi Delta has seen a major decrease in sediment flux, and as a result, a lot of erosion, mainly, not mainly, but most notably wetland. So wetlands have been decimated, still are. It's not by any means solved. Still are decimated in the Mississippi Delta because wetlands require that annual influx of sediment through especially flooding. So what they've been doing in the Mississippi, they kind of breach some of the levees and the channeling within the Mississippi Delta to allow sediment to move out, and not because the Mississippi Delta is also, I have a picture of it somewhere over here, is also extremely elongated. So where's my Mississippi? No. Never mind. I'm trying to look at my slides while I'm talking to you. So the Mississippi is also very elongated. So the water leaves the delta quite far away from the coast, from the river itself. So they breach that. So that's one way to try to do it. But in reality, if you don't have the sediment because it's trapped somewhere upstream, it's really hard to recover that. Although I should say that we are now working on a new project. I didn't show any of that and Sergey, that should be particularly interesting to you, I think, looking at remote sensing by a colleague in the US, of sediment, and we're trying to get a better sense of how sediment is really trapped behind dams and how much is it. Because we have all these sediment trapping estimates, but we know they're not very good because there's not a lot of data out there. So with remote sensing, you can actually really quantify the amount of sediment that's being trapped. And so that's something that I think is quite exciting. But yeah, I mean, I think there's, because this is one of those, like climate change is this slow moving disaster, right. You know, we don't necessarily do much about it in many cases. We try to solve it with patching it, but you know, a lot of time engineering solutions like armoring the coastline and so on, they can come back and bite you because sometimes they have negative effect in the long run. That's been the case in many locations. So I understand, you know, the Brahmaputra, for example, where you have a lot of flooding there. There's been a lot of effort now to try to protect the communities along the Brahmaputra in Bangladesh. So they're now building all these levees and armoring the river, which is a very wild river. What are the long-term impact of that? We see that in New Orleans, for example, in the Mississippi, they build these levees to protect cities in the lower Mississippi River. As a result, the rivers keep rising because of you need to build increase the size of the levees, but the cities are getting lower and lower relative to these. And you see it all over the world, right? This is not unique to New Orleans. New Orleans is just an extreme example because it's a big city that's basically below sea level. And therefore, every time there's a big event, it's at a risk of basically being completely flooded. So anyway, I kind of went off a little further than what you asked, but deltas are really, really interesting.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And maybe sometimes it's better to looking at natural-based solutions. However, I don't know any of them. Yeah, but and we have one more question from Pankaj Kumar. Question is how to model or include gulling in global erosion scale. Is there any model for regional scale which count for sheet as well as gully erosion?
So really good question. It's going to be hard, in my view, to really, you know, explicitly model gullying per se. The solution, I think, is to find proxies to gullying potential and gullying severity, and that's include all the other things like sheet erosion and so on. I can tell you, so these models that I presented, that those recent models that were just published, and this was not my models, I'm just aware of them, I didn't develop them. What they did, they either use what's called the RUSLE or USLE style equations, as I showed one of them explicitly doing that. And what it says is, it's basically giving you some sort of a proxy of how erosive is a landscape based on its soil characteristics, its topography, precipitation characteristics, land cover, and so on. So that's basically what these are doing in a nutshell. Now, going even more explicitly than that, meaning looking at something like landform evolution models that explicitly simulate the gullying or surface erosion, and then trying to couple that maybe in the future that will be possible. The problem is right now is these models require very high resolution implementation, which is not feasible at very large scales. We also don't have the data really at that scales. So these are the current limitation, but I'm sure there's a lot of young people that are listening. So your career is in front of you. So yeah, this is where we are going. I like to think of the climate community. So they develop what we now use, right? Weather predictions and forecasting. And they use global climate models that we use to project future climate. Over the years, they have built on their improvements to look at more higher and higher scale or higher and higher resolution and solving more and more of the dynamics. And they also started a lot of for example, weather forecasting. It still is, to be honest, but it was definitely initially a lot of statistics, right? They said, okay, yesterday was like this, or 5 days ago or like this. Most likely with everything we see, this is what the next 2 days are going to look like. It's still some of that, but now they are able to really simulate a lot of the energy and processes in cloud. And anyway, I think this is where the geomorphology community is also moving towards. So we always lag in a little bit just because our topic is is much less funded, and there's much less critical mass when it comes to sediment modeling compared to weather or even water modeling, hydrology. So, but to answer the question, yeah, at the moment, I don't see us explicitly simulating these processes at that scale, but this is where we sort of need to move to one way or the other.
Thank you, Seigi. I think it's a good finishing point, to know how to move forward and which topic is the most interesting in this area. So I think we're finished. It was the last lecture for today. I hope you're so you haven't tired yet. Lecturers as well as participants, lecturers, and I don't know. I think we're finishing for today, Sergey, right? Would you like to do some announcement or for tomorrow meeting?
No, I would say thanks also for speakers today and for the last lecture, Sagi. Thank you a lot. You joined and accepted our invitation. That's really a good silver line, as you said, during these times that we have these opportunities to bring people together. We would never imagine even such kind of possibilities to invite so many excellent lecturers to the such kind of seminar, that we will be able to, that everyone is coming, so that's something good is happening in the world. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.
And we'll keep in touch. So we are finishing now the YouTube, and tomorrow at 4 Moscow time we have 4 more lectures and the end of this lecture seminar series. So, and please participants join tomorrow our lectures. You have the schedule on the website and in your mails as well. And thank you for participation. Yeah. Goodbye.
Thank you.